You'll notice that it says part 2. If you want to listen to part 1, you can go on my YouTube channel. All you have to do is look for the channel named Wilbur Atwood. Make sure you spell it with a U, and you'll be able to get it. When you see the big circle with a W in it, hit that and you'll get it. I have been very concerned recently about the subject of religious liberty. And the thing that sparked my deep concern was listening to our United States President when he described his view of religious liberty. His view is that it's time that we allowed the pastors to influence the political scene and to tell their parishioners how to get, America great again. That's his objective, to make America great again. But from my study, I can say that by that path, America will never be great again. Also, for a long time, in fact, many years ago, I got a book in the mail that was mailed out to all the pastors in the United States. And in that book, they went to great lengths to establish what they believed was needed to save this country. And essentially, they believe that this is a Christian nation and that Christians need to take control of this country and turn things around and get it to where it needs to be. The only problem is that history does not support that idea. Now, of course, having Christians in government is a good thing if they're a true Christian. But if they don't understand religious liberty, it becomes a serious problem. And so I want to take us back to what it was that made this country great. There's no question when you look at the history of the United States that it very rapidly arose to be the greatest nation on earth. And it has been tested a number of times, but it has always come out on top. And yet, if we don't understand what made it great, we're going to lose it, and I'm afraid there's very few that understand. Now, you're aware, I'm sure, from your religious liberty leader, that we're in a campaign to raise money to purchase the Liberty magazine and to get it out to all the thought leaders of our country to try to help them understand. And if you haven't seen the importance of that campaign in the past, I hope you will this year. Because if they don't wake up, we're headed for some serious times. A quick review of the systems of government that we find in the Bible. The first one we find is the patriarchal system. In other words, the oldest person, supposedly, it's not always true, but it seemed to be true back in those times. The oldest person who knew the most about God's will was the leader of the rest. And that patriarchal system lasted for about 20 generations. And it was a successful one as long as they recognized we are leading so that we can lead in the way that God said for us to go, in the path that he has marked out. Then a change came in as we look at Moses and the forming of the Israelite nation. We had what we call a theocracy. Now that is what the Christian world today thinks they are trying to put together, but they don't understand how a theocracy works. You see, God gave a vast array of instructions about how the state should be governed, and the only authority they had was to make sure that it was carried out. And if there was something that was not written of what should be done, they had to go to the Urim and Thummim and find out what they should do. So it wasn't Christians in control, it was God in control. Of course, they didn't endure that system too long. And so it wasn't very long until they wanted to have the same system of government that the world had, which was kings. Now, a kingly program is self-defeating because since the king can do so much for people, people treat the king in a way that ruins the king. And then the king ruins the people. So it's a very destructive system. And they very rapidly found out we made a mistake to want a king, but they didn't get rid of the system. They still had to put up with the king. And, you know, sometimes I wonder if we don't have a kingly system in our country in certain areas, because that's the natural way that humans tend to think in this whole world. But when we come to the time of the early Christian church, a sizable change was made. And when Jesus set up the church, he did not give to the church the secular authority. He only gave to the church authority in regard to our religious practices and so on. And even then, there's a limit with how much authority church leaders have. And then he gave to the state the authority to govern the rest of what used to be under a theocracy. In Revelation 13, verse 11, we see that for a long time, God was not able to get a state that understood their proper role. And so in the old world especially, we have kings that were controlling the religious life of the people, and usually a state church developed. And once there was a state church, if people didn't want to worship God the way the state wanted them to, they were persecuted and killed, many of them, for practicing religion in a different way. But finally, God found a power that would do it the right way. And it's spoken of in Revelation 13:11. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. Why does it mention earth? Because seas in the Bible and waters represent large populations of people. But this country was to arise in a sparsely populated area. And although there were people living here, the Indians, they were very sparsely populating the U.S. And so this beast was to come up out of the earth. And he had two horns, like a lamb. The other beasts in the Bible are represented by one horn, but this one is represented by two horns. Also, it is represented to be as a lamb. And both of those things are significant. But unfortunately, here is what will be the end result in this country. And he spake as a dragon. So it starts out like a lamb, but it ends up like a dragon. That's not unusual. It happens even in religious organizations. We've just studied the 4 horsemen, and you can see that Jesus was obviously the rider of the white horse, but when we get to the red horse, nobody knew that Jesus was no longer riding the horse. Instead, it was Satan, and he rode the rest of the 3 horses, and we can see what he did through the church. But here we're looking at this amazing new power that would do something that nobody else had ever done. They would separate the authority between church and state, and they would have freedom of religion for all. However, as we look at the very early history of this country, we see that God had to do some real work to get us there, because when the Puritans, who were the first ones to come over to this country, they had been persecuted in the old world, and they were anxious to get somewhere. First, they went into Europe, hoping they could get some freedom there, but they had trouble there as well. And so finally, many of them decided to brave the ocean and come to this country. And they had at last freedom, but it was only for them. Anybody that differed with them did not have freedom. And so if you were riding your horse on Sunday and you weren't going to church, you were fined or put in prison. If you were not going to the Puritan church, you couldn't be a government official. There were all kinds of problems that they brought over with them to this country, and God had to use somebody else to straighten it out. They thought they were straightening it out, but they did not see the picture. But you know, God always has somebody. When it's time for something to happen, he has somebody. And the one that he had was Roger Williams. He too was persecuted by the Puritans. In fact, the only hope he had of surviving was to escape and live in the woods in the middle of winter. And if any of you have ever lived up in New England in the middle of winter, you know that's not an easy time to be out there in the snow and with all the dangers and problems of finding food and so on. But the Lord preserved his life. The Indians helped him some, and his life was preserved. So in Great Controversy 293, it says, 11 years after the planting of the first colony, Roger Williams came to the New World. Like the early pilgrims, he came to enjoy religious freedom. But unlike them, he saw what so few in his time had yet seen, that this freedom was the inalienable right of all, whatever might be their creed. Now, one of the reasons I think we need to think about this is because I've grown up in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and I've witnessed many things. And I'm not sure that we give each other religious freedom. We are a little bit like the Puritans when it comes. As long as somebody practices the Adventist faith like we want them to practice it, we give religious liberty. But if they depart from that, we're not so free to give them religious liberty. So we need to understand it in its purity. What is religious liberty? That this freedom was the inalienable right of all, whatever might be their creed. Now, of course, there is a place to say, you can't practice that here. You're free to practice it, but you can't practice it as a church member. Or you can practice that, but you can't do it at Wawa. That is appropriate. But to give religious liberty to all is very, very important. Whatever might be their creed. He was an earnest seeker for truth. With Robinson, that should say Williams, with Williams holding it impossible that all the light from God's word had yet been received. Williams was the first person in modern Christendom to assert in its plenitude the doctrine of the liberty of conscience, the equality of opinions before the law. So God used this man to establish one of our states. That was the only way he could put this into practice. And God used him to establish the little state of Rhode Island. It's a very small state. I have passed through it a few times, but never lived there. But this was a tremendous blessing to make this country great. If they had stayed the way the Puritans thought, and that's kind of the way modern Christians are thinking, like the Puritans, not fully yet, but the beginning of it, this country would have been no better than any other country in the world. But because God led for Roger Williams' philosophy, which was God's philosophy, to be established, it made it possible for this country to rise to power. And also, one of my conclusions is that the number one reason why God wanted this country to manifest religious liberty is so that the Seventh-day Adventist Church could be established in this country and spread into all the world. Great Controversy 294. Here's a little bit of his philosophy. He declared it to be the duty of the magistrate to restrain crime, but never to control the conscience. So the government has a duty to control crime. If somebody breaks one of the last 6 commandments, then the state has the right to say you can't do that, or there will be punishment because you did that. That is appropriate. The public or the magistrates may decide, he said, what is due from men to men. But when they attempt to prescribe a man's duty to God, they are out of place, and there can be no safety. For it is clear that if the magistrate has the power, he may decree one set of opinions or beliefs today and another tomorrow. And it goes on to give some examples of where that has happened. So as we look at this, it's a pretty good definition of true religious liberty. The state has the right to control the last 6 commandments, but only God has the right to control the first 4 commandments. And if the state begins to think that it can control those first 4 commandments, then they are departing from the religious liberty principle. Now, we have to also be willing to give religious liberty to all the other people that worship God differently. We are welcome to point out that the Bible doesn't teach what they teach, but we must give them religious liberty. If we are going to have it, we have to give it to them. That means we give it to the Catholics, we give it to the Methodists, to the Baptists, to all, to worship God the way they choose to worship Him. And another thing I've noticed over a number of years now is that the devil is busy getting religious organizations to do really crazy things, and it is leading the justices of the United States, many of them, to think that religious liberty is a bad idea because of so many crazy things. But what they don't realize is that it will be worse if we get rid of religious liberty. I agree that some things look pretty bad, what people want to do in the name of religion. But the old days reveal what happens when religious liberty is taken away. Great Controversy 294. Attendance at the services of the established church was required under a penalty of fine or imprisonment. Williams reprobated the law. The worst statute of the English Code was that which did but enforce attendance upon the parish church. In other words, you had to go to church. I don't know why a pastor would be happy for that. To have to preach to a bunch of people that are sleeping because they wish they weren't there. And of course, sometimes we get people that their conscience bothers them if they don't come, but they're not really interested. We do get some of that in our church. But how would you like to have the government make sure that everybody went to church? Doesn't sound good to me. To compel men to unite with those of a different creed, he regarded as an open violation of their natural rights. To drag to public worship the irreligious and the unwilling seemed like requiring hypocrisy. You're making people act like a Christian to some degree, but they're not really Christian. No one, he said, should be forced to worship or to maintain a worship against his own consent. You can see how he understood things very, very well. If the preaching cannot bring people to church, the preacher has to admit he doesn't have the power of the Holy Spirit. But many ministers don't want to admit that they don't have the power of the Spirit, and so they're happy when the government makes people go to church. Same book, page 295. The fundamental principle of Roger Williams' colony was, quote, that every man should have the right to worship God according to the light of his conscience. His little state, Rhode Island, became the asylum of the oppressed, and it increased and prospered until its foundation principles, civil and religious liberty, became the cornerstones of the American Republic. Isn't that amazing? Little tiny state. It's one of the smallest states in the United States. But the Lord blessed it because the leader was straight on this matter of religious liberty. And the kind of people, I can just imagine the kind of people that went to that state. They were people of conscience. They were people that recognized that the government didn't have the right to control their conscience. And so they went there, and God was able to bless them. And he blessed so much that it took over the whole country. And the whole country declared in favor of religious liberty. Our founding fathers, when they drew up the documents, one is called the Constitution, the other one is called the Bill of Rights. And I'll just read a small section from the Bill of Rights. It says, this is quoted also from Great Controversy 295, but I have a copy of that document at home. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, we don't have the right to take somebody's life because of the way they worship God. We don't have the right to do that. So, here it is stated, but the interpretation of this document is being changed. I used to think that they would have to do away with these documents. Now, I don't think so. I mean, they may do away with them, but more likely they just reinterpret it to mean something else. Went blank. Did something turn off? That's a bad thing about depending on technology. Although I do have my sermon in the car and my computer.
While you're finding that, I just have a question. When was the first Bill of Rights created?
Well, 1776 is looked upon as the time when all these concepts came together and were put in place. 1776. That was very interestingly, 1798 is the beginning of the end of time in the Bible. And 1776, God was preparing this country to be able to present to the world this freedom. And again, as I've concluded, he was preparing this country for the birth of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, because we could not exist in the old world philosophy. It would be impossible. We'd be in prison, we'd be fined, and many would be killed. And of course, we know that's coming because the understanding of religious liberty is changing and is going back to the way that it was before. Any other questions? Well, let me just talk about a little more, a few things till they can get that going. In the meantime, though, maybe, honey, could you go in my car and get the computer in case I have to use that? It's on the front seat. Oh, here we go. We got it back. Okay, this quotation is from the Constitution. Again, recorded in Great Controversy 295. And the Constitution guarantees, in the most explicit terms, the inviolability of conscience. Quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States." Now, that just brought to mind something that we have experienced not long ago. We had a Seventh-day Adventist running for president. And do you know what the number one reason was he didn't make it? Well, it might have been that. It was because he was a Seventh-day Adventist. And people began to talk about what Seventh-day Adventists believe. And of course, they weren't all straight about what Seventh-day Adventists believe. He tried his best to correct what he could, but that should not exist if all Americans understood religious liberty. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. And probably when the first Catholic president was running for office, Seventh-day Adventists would have been tempted to say, no, not a Catholic. We don't want a Catholic to be president of the United States. But the first one was one of the best presidents of this country, and he got shot. But if he had been able to live, he would have been a really good president from all we can tell. So this goes both ways. No religious test. It doesn't matter. I heard a lot of squawking from Christians when we had a Muslim president. But if we understand religious liberty, it shouldn't matter whether he's a Muslim or a Catholic or whatever he is. It shouldn't matter. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, government cannot, well, I shouldn't say they can't because they misinterpret this, but they're not supposed to establish any religion as the religion for the United States. And second, they are not to interfere with the free exercise of religion as people feel their conscience dictates to them. Those things were built in there. We were not a theocracy, but we were a country that separated church and state, and both understood their proper realm of authority. Now, in one of the congressional documents, there's a further explanation here. The framers of the Constitution recognized the eternal principle that man's relation to his God is above human legislation, and his right of conscience inalienable. Reasoning was not necessary to establish this truth. We are conscious of it in our own bosom. In other words, if you believe the seventh day is the Sabbath, nobody is going to be able to stop you. No matter how many laws they pass, they will not be able to stop you, because you believe you must honor what God has asked you to do. And that's been tested over and over again, and people will go to their death rather than surrender to the government on that issue. It is this consciousness which, in defiance of human laws, has sustained so many martyrs in tortures and flames. They felt that their duty to God was superior to human enactments, and that man could exercise no authority over their consciences. It is an inborn principle which nothing can eradicate. If you're not convinced that much, then you're not convinced. It's just an opinion. But if you really believe that the Sabbath should be kept no matter what, then it is a conviction, and you will do it no matter what pressure is put upon you. They can fine you, they can persecute you, they can throw you out, they can kill you, but you will not give it up. Now, it's interesting to notice that even in the churches, occasionally there's somebody that sees this. And Bengel of Germany was a Lutheran, and he had a revolutionary idea for Lutherans. In Great Controversy 363, Bengel, a minister in the Lutheran Church and a celebrated biblical scholar and critic, becoming a member of the consistory of Wittenberg, he advocated the cause of religious liberty, while maintaining the rights and privileges of the church. He was an advocate for all reasonable freedom being accorded to those who felt themselves bound on grounds of conscience to withdraw from her communion. In other words, he didn't make fun of them. He didn't persecute them. He felt they have a perfect right. If they don't feel they should worship as the Lutherans do, they have a perfect right to go and worship where they believe they should. That is very unusual inside the church, because the church is in just as much danger of not exhibiting religious liberty as the state is in danger. In Great Controversy 441, it explains why we had two horns on the lamb. And he had two horns like a lamb. The lamb-like horns indicate youth. So it indicated that our country would start from a place where there wasn't a country. You know, most countries, just one leader takes over from another and so on. But here we have a young power. Indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. The Christian exiles who first fled to America sought an asylum from the royal oppression and priestly intolerance. Notice the two: royal oppression, priestly intolerance. And they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. So civil liberty is just as important as religious liberty. The Declaration of Independence sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government. You know, this has been lost sight of too, but when the government gets off base, according to the majority, they have every right to remove the leaders and put others in. That's the way it was set up. Providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. So here's another meaning of the two horns. Republicanism. Now we have two parties, Republicans and Democrats. This is not speaking of Republicans. It's speaking of the form of government that we have, where the people elect their leaders. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. So if our president wants to make America great, again, he has to go back to this principle that this country was founded upon, and then God would bless this country. However, it won't happen because prophecy does not indicate that will happen. Oh, we lost it again. Maybe there's a short up here under the platform, and I step in the wrong place. You know, the Bible is very clear in regard to what brings prosperity. God said, righteousness exalteth a nation. It's not just a Christian. Righteousness exalts a Christian, but righteousness exalts a nation also. And so every nation has had the opportunity to rise to power if they just would practice righteousness. But very few have done it. The founders of the nation wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of the church, with its inevitable result, intolerance and persecution. But there is a fact that I learned in one of my history classes, and here was the fact. There's one thing we learn from history, one thing we learn from history, and that is we don't learn from history. And so, unfortunately, that is being lost. The lesson that the leaders of this country knew in the beginning, that has been lost. They knew the inevitable result, intolerance and persecution. The Constitution provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Now, let me just mention a small point. Sometimes it's not a real small point. But if the government says Everybody needs to rest on Sabbath. You can't run your business on Sabbath. On Sunday. You can't run your business on Sunday. Everybody on Sunday needs to stop. This gives Seventh-day Adventists an unfair opportunity because they worship on the seventh-day Sabbath and they can't work on Sunday either. But the Sunday keepers can work on the seventh day. They can work 6 days of the week, but we can't. That is a small way of establishing religion in this country. Everybody should be seeing that, but they're not. And it looks like that this family day on Sunday is probably going to go through. Now, how does the Pope view religious liberty? Pope Pius IX, in his encyclical letter of August 15, 1854, said, "The absurd and erroneous doctrines or ravings in defense of liberty of conscience are a most pestilential error, a pest of all others, most to be dreaded in a state." You see, the Catholic Church cannot exist when there is religious freedom. The same Pope, in his encyclical letter of December 8, 1864, anathematized those who assert the liberty of conscience and of religious worship. Also, all such as maintain that the church may not employ force. So the Catholic Church, of course, they're kind of quiet about that right now, but that is their belief. They haven't changed the belief that they have the right to force people to go to church and to worship as they want them to worship. And they hate religious liberty because so many people choose to worship in a different way. Now, here's one from the U.S. Bishop O'Connor, of course, is dead now, but here's what he said. Religious liberty is merely endured until the opposite can be carried into effect without peril to the Catholic world. So he said, we put up with it when the majority are against us, but if the majority ever get in our favor, then we do away with religious liberty. And if you watch anything, any YouTube videos about what's happening right now, the majority has tipped in favor of doing exactly what the Catholic Church would like them to do. But we still have Matthew 22:21. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. And there are some Seventh-day Adventists that don't want to do that. They don't want to pay their income tax. They don't want to even get a license to drive a vehicle and all kinds of things that, they don't want to do. But God said very clearly, Caesar has a right to certain things. And when Caesar is giving you those requirements, you are to follow it. And unto God, the things that are God's. And that's especially the first 4 commandments. Now, there are 2 really clear statements about religious liberty, and I think as Seventh-day Adventists, we need to understand them very well. The first one is in Great Controversy, page 201, and this one was stated by political leaders. Some of them were Christian, but this was their view, and they registered their view with the king. It was called the Protest of the Princes. To protect liberty of conscience is the duty of the state. So the state has a responsibility to make sure that every one of its subjects has religious liberty. And this is the limit of its authority in matters of religion. That has been lost sight of, but that is a correct understanding. And what a blessing it would be if every political leader in the world understood like those princes understood when they protested. And the other one is from Roger Williams, Great Controversy 294. The public or the magistrates may decide what is due from men to men, but when they attempt to prescribe a man's duty to God, they are out of place. And so we need to give people room when they come to us and they say, my conscience won't let me do that. It may seem crazy to you, but if their conscience bothers them to do that, don't criticize them. Don't find fault with them unless you can show them from the Word of God that they're wrong. Even then, if they don't take it, we have to give them religious liberty. If we expect to have religious liberty, we better give it to other people. May God help us to do all we can to get the issue out, to kind of hold back as long as we can. You know, some people think, well, it's going to come, just let it come. But we've been warned, don't think that way. We are to do everything we can to postpone this and to inform people about their rights for religious liberty. I go to a meeting down in Trenton where all the people that are trying to benefit the community come together and they listen to each other, talk about their ministry and what they're doing. There's about 25 or 30 people. And when I got concerned about this, I wrote to the leader and I said, can I talk to the group about religious liberty? So I got back a email, and the email didn't say no. All the positions are filled for this year, but they sounded like if somebody cancels, that they would give me that opportunity. So I invite you to pray that somebody won't be able to make their appointment and that I'll be able to speak to them, because I want to do what I can to help the Trenton community understand religious liberty properly. May God bless us all to do what we can.